Welcome to the useless hour. Tonight, we consider something that does not matter at all, and we are going to take our time about it. Tonight, our subject is the fax machine, a device that most people, if they think of it at all, imagine to be a relic of the 1980s, a fixture of grey offices and humming back rooms, a thing that arrived late and refused, somewhat impolitely, to leave. But this impression, comfortable as it is entirely wrong, and the truth is stranger and slower and far more suited to the darkened hour in which you now find yourself. For the fax machine is not young. The fax machine is very, very old. Consider, for a moment, the ordinary furniture of the modern world and the order in which it is generally supposed to have arrived. The telephone, we say, came first, and from the telephone eventually came all the rest, the long cables and the ringing bells and the voices carried across distances. The electric light, we imagine, glowed into being somewhere in that same busy age of invention, and after it, in a tidy procession, everything else. And yet the machine that could take an image, a drawing, a page of handwriting, and send that image along a wire to be reproduced faithfully in another place entirely, that machine was patented in the year 1843. It is older than the telephone. It is older than the electric light bulb. It is older by a full generation than the first telephone call ever placed, which would not come until 1876, 33 years later. You do not need to remember that number. You do not need to remember any of this. It is simply true, quietly and without fuss, that the fax machine was already an old idea before the telephone was a new one. The man responsible was a Scotsman named Alexander Bain. He was born in 1811 in the far north of Scotland, in Caithness, in a place of long winters and thin light, and a great many sheep. And he was by trade and by temperament a clockmaker. This detail matters, though it will not seem to at first. Bain understood mechanisms that keep time. He understood the patient, repeating swing of a pendulum, the way a weighted arm can be made to move back and forth with a regularity so exact that you could, if you wished, build a whole world upon it. He had already turned his attention to the electric clock, a clock kept running not by falling weights or coiled springs, but by the steady pulse of electricity. And it was from this quiet obsession with things that swing and repeat and keep faithful time that the idea of sending pictures down a wire slowly, almost accidentally, emerged. The principle, once you sit with it, is beautiful in its simplicity, and I will describe it gently, because there is no hurry, and because understanding it fully is not required of you tonight. Imagine a message, a few letters perhaps, or a simple shape, rendered not in ordinary ink, but in raised metal type, in lines of conductive metal standing slightly proud of a surface, the way the letters on an old printing block stand up to be inked. Now imagine a small metal stylus, a little pointed finger, mounted at the end of a swinging pendulum. As the pendulum swings, the stylus sweeps across the surface of the metal message, in a line from one side to the other. Where it touches raised metal, an electric current passes. Where it touches the gaps between, no current passes. And so the message, as the stylus sweeps across it, is translated into a rhythm of current and no current, a pattern of contact and silence sent flowing down a wire. At the far end of that wire, in another place entirely, sits a second pendulum, and here is the part that reveals the clockmaker's hand. The second pendulum must swing in perfect step with the first. They must be synchronized, the two of them, kept in time with one another, as faithfully as two clocks set to the same hour, so that as the sending stylus sweeps line 1, the receiving stylus sweeps line 1 also, and line 2 matches line 2, and so on, patiently down the page. The receiving stylus rests upon a sheet of paper that has been treated with a chemical, a paper that darkens, that stains, wherever an electric current passes through it. And so, as the current arrives in its rhythm of contact and silence, the receiving stylus marks the paper dark, or leaves it pale, line by line, by sweep, until the whole of the original message has been rebuilt in stains upon the distant page, an image transmitted, a picture sent across a wire and made again in another room. This, in 1843, was what Alexander Bain patented. He called it, in the sober language of the Patent Office, an improvement in producing and regulating electric currents, and improvements in electric clocks, and in electric printing and signal telegraphs, for the word fax, short for facsimile, a Latin borrowing meaning simply make alike, would not attach itself to such machines for a great many years yet. He had, in essence, built a device for making a thing alike in two places at once. That the two pendulums never swung quite perfectly in time, that the synchronization was imperfect, and the images that arrived were faint and streaked and troublesome, that Bain's machine in practice was a fragile and finicky thing, that never carried a single message of any real consequence, none of this changes the central, quietly astonishing fact around which this entire evening turns. The thing was invented. The idea was written down and stamped and filed, before the telephone, before the light bulb. In the reign of a young Queen Victoria, when messages still traveled by horse and by ship, and by the newly strung wires of the ordinary telegraph, a Scottish clockmaker had already imagined and built a way to send a picture through a wire. There is a particular melancholy to an invention that arrives too early, and it is worth resting in that melancholy for a moment, here in the dark, because it is a soft and undemanding sort of feeling, the kind that asks nothing of you. Bain's machine had no world ready to receive it. There was no network of the right kind of wires, no industry waiting to manufacture it, no clamor of people needing to send images to one another across great distances. It was an answer to a question that no one had yet thought to ask, a solution arriving decades ahead of its problem, a small marvel set down gently in a century that simply was not ready and turned, politely, to other things. Bain himself would spend much of his later life in disputes over patents and priority, in the slow grinding machinery of who thought of it first, and he would die in 1877, not wealthy, his great facsimile idea having drifted quietly to the margins of the age, an odd footnote, a curiosity, a swing of the pendulum that seemed, at the time, to lead nowhere at all. And yet it did not lead nowhere. That is the strange and patient thing about this device, the thing we will follow unhurriedly over the hours to come. The idea did not die with Bain. It sank, rather, beneath the surface of history, out of sight, and it waited, and every so often, across the long decades that followed, it would rise again in the hands of some other quiet, methodical inventor, be reworked, be improved a little, sink once more, and rise again, refusing, across nearly 2 centuries now, to do the one sensible thing that every technology is eventually expected to do, which is to lie down and become extinct. But all of that is still ahead of us. For now it is enough to hold in your mind, loosely as you settle, the single soft fact at the heart of tonight, that the fax machine is older than the telephone, that a clockmaker in the north of Scotland set two pendulums swinging in 1843, and that the picture they sent, faint and imperfect, was the first thin whisper of a machine that would prove almost impossible to kill. From that first dream of two pendulums swinging in secret agreement across a wire, the story does not leap forward into triumph, as the stories of great inventions usually do, but instead settles quietly into a long and gentle wandering, a stretch of years in which the idea of sending a picture down a wire existed and worked and mattered to almost no one at all. None of it needs remembering, and there will be no examination. It is simply the truth that after Alexander Bain had shown that a message might be scanned line by line and reassembled at the far end, the world received this miracle roughly the way one receives news of a distant cousin's promotion, with a slow nod and a return to whatever it had been doing before. Into this soft indifference stepped an Englishman named Frederick Bakewell, a man of private means and patient curiosity, who looked at Bain's arrangement and concluded, reasonably enough, that it could be made rather better. Where Bain had worked with metal type and a somewhat awkward scanning comb, Bakewell imagined something more elegant, a message written in a special non-conducting ink upon a sheet of metal foil, and that foil wrapped snugly around a rotating cylinder, a drum that turned slowly, while a fine stylus traced its way across the surface, reading the writing as a spiral of tiny electrical yeses and nos. This cylinder, this turning drum, is worth holding in your mind for just a moment, gently, before you let it go, because it is the shape the fax machine would keep, in one form or another, for very nearly the next century and a half. Bakewell had found the posture the technology would hold while the entire modern world was built around it, and he found it in the 1840s, when the modern world had scarcely begun. He called his creation the image telegraph, and in 1851 he brought it to London, to the Great Exhibition, that vast, glittering cathedral of glass in Hyde Park, where the industrial age gathered up its proudest achievements and set them out beneath the sun for the public to admire. Amid the locomotives, the looms, the hydraulic presses, and the endless improving machinery of a confident empire, Bakewell's apparatus turned its patient drum and transmitted its small facsimiles, a curiosity among curiosities, admired politely, and then, for the most part, walked past. It worked. That is the quietly astonishing thing. In the same year that the crowds marveled at the Crystal Palace, a machine sat among them, faithfully copying handwriting from one cylinder to another by electricity, and the crowds, having a great deal else to look at, largely declined to be amazed. And here the story might have simply dissolved, as so many clever 19th century contraptions dissolved into yellowing patents in the occasional footnote, had it not been for a gentle, bearded Italian who had arrived at the whole problem by an unusually roundabout road. His name was Giovanni Caselli, and before he was a physicist, he had been a priest, and before he settled into his experiments, he had worked as a tutor to a noble family, and had lived through the political upheavals of the Italian peninsula closely enough to be sent away from one of the cities he loved. He was, by every account, a mild and devout and deeply methodical man, the sort of person who takes a half-finished idea that the world has set down and picks it up and turns it over in his hands for years. What Caselli built out of that long turning over was not a mere improvement, it was a monument. He called it the Pantelegraph, a grand name assembled from Greek roots, meaning more or less the writing of all things at a distance. And if you had walked into a room and found one standing there, you would not have mistaken it for a piece of office equipment. It rose to something close to 2 meters in height, a towering framework of iron and brass, and at its heart swung a great pendulum, a long and stately pendulum, whose slow, regular arc governed the scanning of the message, sweeping a stylus back and forth across a curved plate, while the whole magnificent assembly kept time with itself and with its distant twin. To keep the sending machine and the receiving machine moving in step across many miles of wire, Caselli devised a system of regulation so careful, so patiently corrected, that 2 of these cathedrals of brass, standing in cities far apart, could be persuaded to breathe together. It is difficult, lying in the dark, to picture the thing without a certain hush. It looked less like a telegraph and more like some devotional instrument, an orrery for the transmission of ordinary human handwriting, and one imagines it required a small ceremony merely to be switched on. You do not need to remember its dimensions, or its mechanism, or even its name. It is enough tonight to know that it existed, and that it was beautiful, and that for a brief while it was real in the most ordinary sense a thing can be real. People used it, and paid for it, and got their money's worth. For this is the part that dignifies the whole long, drowsy tale. Caselli's Pantelegraph did not remain a marvel behind glass. It became a service. The Emperor Napoleon III, who had a fondness for the impressive machinery of progress, took an interest in the Italian's work, and under his authority a genuine functioning facsimile line was established in France, running first between Paris and Lyon, and later reaching onward toward Marseille, so that a person in one city might set down a message, or more importantly, a signature, and have it appear faithfully in another city far to the south.
That detail, the signature, is the small, tender heart of the matter. For the great practical use to which this soaring brass cathedral was put was the verification of handwriting for the banks, the confirmation that the name at the bottom of an order was truly the name it claimed to be, so that money might move between cities with the reassurance that the mark had been carried exactly and not merely described. A machine built like a shrine, governed by a solemn pendulum, tended by trained operators along a wire across the French countryside, and its daily labor was to make certain that a gentleman in Lyon really had signed what a clerk in Paris said he had signed. There is no need to smile at this. It was serious work, done seriously, and it worked. And then, as quietly as it had arrived, it went away. The service never truly caught on, never became the thing people reached for by habit, never wove itself into the ordinary texture of the age the way the plain electric telegraph had done with its dots and its dashes. It was expensive, and it was delicate, and the volume of messages that genuinely required a faithful copy of the handwriting itself, rather than a simple transcription of the words, turned out to be smaller than anyone had hoped. The upheavals that swept over France around the year 1870 did the rest, and somewhere in that turning of events the Pantelegraph lines fell silent, and the great instruments were set aside, and the whole enterprise was folded up and quietly put away. So the wire went cold, and the pendulums came to rest, and facsimile transmission, having been demonstrated and refined and actually sold to a paying public across an entire nation, sank back down into obscurity, into the drawers and the archives and the patient patience of unwanted good ideas. It was, in the fullest sense, a solved problem, complete and working and proven, that the world simply did not want yet.
The century would turn and turn again, and the towering brass cathedral would gather its dust in the dark, waiting, without impatience, for an age that had not yet been invented to remember that it had needed this all along. And so the century turned, as centuries do, without ceremony, and the strange sleeping idea of the transmitted picture, dormant since Bain, since Bakewell, since Caselli's beautiful and forgotten Pantelegraph, was quietly picked up again by hands that did not know, or did not much care, how many times it had already been set down. You do not need to remember the names that follow. They will not be tested. They are offered only because they are true, and because there is a certain restfulness in true things laid end to end in the dark. In the first years of the 1900s, in Germany, there worked a physicist named Arthur Korn, a patient and methodical man of the sort the era produced in some abundance. And Korn became preoccupied with a problem that most sensible people had long since agreed to leave alone: the sending of an actual photograph, not a line of writing, not a signature, but a photograph with all its grey middle tones, its shadows and its soft grades of light, along an ordinary wire. To do this, he leaned upon selenium, that curious element whose electrical resistance shifts according to how much light happens to be falling upon it. And by this shifting he could persuade a picture to become, for a little while, a fluctuating current, and then persuade that current at the far end to become a picture once more. It is worth pausing gently on how odd and how quiet a miracle that is: a face dissolved into a trembling of electricity, sent down a copper thread, and reassembled in another city by a machine that had never seen the face and would never be told whose it was. Korn's system was called telephotography, or in the German, more soberly still, Bildtelegraphy, the telegraphy of images, and around the year 1907 he demonstrated it at a distance that genuinely mattered, sending photographs between great cities of Europe. Munich, Berlin, Paris were among them, over the long telegraph lines that already stitched the continent together. A photograph, in other words, could leave one capital in the morning and arrive in another before the day was out, not carried in a satchel, not folded into a mail sack aboard a train, but simply read aloud, line by line, in the private grammar of electrical pulses, and copied out again at the other end. The newspapers of the day found this remarkable, and said so, though the ordinary reader, buttering his toast, had no notion that such a thing was possible, and no particular reason to acquire one. And Korn, not content, went further, and set his images loose upon the air itself, transmitting photographs by radio, without wires at all, across distances that included, in time, the reach between Europe and America, a picture flung invisibly over the ocean and caught faintly on the other shore. None of this, you will notice, made him a household name. Very little in this history makes anyone a household name. That is rather the point.
Meanwhile, in France, a second man was working the same seam, and his name was Edouard Bain, and where Korn was the physicist, Bain was in temperament something closer to the engineer and the practical improver. The man who asks not only whether a thing can be done, but whether it can be done in a box that one person can lift. Around the year 1913, he brought forth the device that would carry his name into the working vocabulary of the century, the belinograph. And the belinograph mattered less for any single leap of physics than for a homelier virtue. It was portable. It could be carried to where the news was, set upon a table, connected to an ordinary telephone line, and made to send. A photograph wrapped upon a drum would be scanned by a traveling point of light, its brightness turned to signal, its signal poured down the line, and at the receiving end a beam would darken a sheet of photographic paper in perfect step, rebuilding the image out of nothing but obedient timing.
From this modest and rather beautiful arrangement grew the whole grey empire of the wirephoto, and it is here, if anywhere in this long and undramatic story, that the machine at last found honest employment. The great news agencies, whose entire reason for existing was to know things sooner than anyone else and to prove that they knew them, seized upon the principle. A photograph of an event, a coronation, a flood, a boxer flat upon the canvas, a statesman descending from a train, could now be taken in one place and printed the very next morning in newspapers a continent away, having crossed that continent as a whisper on a wire, rather than as a physical object on a slow and doubtful journey. In the middle 1930s, this hardened into standing networks of leased lines, dedicated to nothing but the trafficking of pictures between cities, so that the image of yesterday's disaster could be waiting, developed and captioned on 1,000,000 breakfast tables at dawn. The reader marveled, if he marveled at all, at the photograph, the freshness of it, the impossible speed, and never once at the machine, humming in some back room of the newspaper office that had drawn it out, line by patient line. The machine, as ever, did its work, and received no thanks, and seemed not to mind.
And then there is the matter of the sea, which deserves its own small measure of gravity. For while newspapers were teaching the facsimile machine to carry faces, another and stranger use was taking root far from any city, out upon the grey water, where a ship is a small and lonely thing beneath an enormous and indifferent sky. A vessel at sea, then as now, has one overwhelming appetite for information, and it is this: what is the weather going to do? And so the principle of the transmitted picture was bent to the drawing of weather maps, the isobars and fronts and swirling pressures of the coming days, rendered not as columns of numbers to be squinted at and imagined, but as an actual chart, a genuine map of the sky's intentions, sent out from shore stations over radio waves, and received aboard a ship that a machine that would, with great slowness and a soft mechanical patience, extrude a printed weather chart line by line into the hands of whoever stood waiting. This is the practice known as radio fax or weather fax, and there is something almost liturgical in the picture of it. The vessel rolling gently on the swell in the small hours, and the machine in its corner of the wheelhouse, unhurried, drawing forth the map of tomorrow's storms, one narrow band at a time, as though reading a prophecy it did not itself understand, and had no stake in either way.
You do not need to remember any of this, and it will do you no harm to let it slip. But it is worth resting for a moment on the fact that this maritime use has never entirely died. Long after the world moved on to satellites and screens and instantaneous everything, the slow radio fax weather chart went on quietly arriving aboard ships that still cared to receive it. A faint and stubborn survival. The sound of a machine drawing weather out of the air in a corner where nobody thinks to look, persisting into our own century the way certain old habits persist, not because they are efficient, but because they work, and because at sea one does not lightly abandon a thing that works. So, by the close of these decades, the situation had arrived, without anyone announcing it, in a curious and enduring shape. The facsimile machine, that ancient orphan of an idea, invented and reinvented and forgotten and found again, at last had jobs. It had two of them. It carried the news and it carried the weather. It fed the morning papers, and it watched over the ships. It had become, in its unglamorous way, genuinely and quietly useful, humming in newsrooms and rocking in wheelhouses, doing real work that mattered to real people. And those real people, buying their papers, sailing their ships, going about the ordinary business of being alive, still had, for the most part, no idea whatsoever that the machine existed. It served them faithfully from behind a curtain they never thought to draw back, and it would go on doing so, patient and anonymous, for a long while yet. For a while, in those early decades, the fax machine existed mostly as a scattering of clever, incompatible islands, each one speaking a private dialect of clicks and tones that no other machine could quite understand. And this, in its own quiet way, was the great unspoken problem of the whole enterprise. A newspaper's picture receiver could take an image from its own sending unit, and a weather office could pull a chart from a partner station it had been carefully tuned to. But a machine built by one firm in one country for one purpose had no natural reason to comprehend a machine built by another. And so the fax remained a technology of private arrangements, of matched pairs, of careful handshakes agreed upon in advance. It could send a page across an ocean, and yet not across a street, if the street happened to hold a rival's equipment. And this is the sort of difficulty that does not announce itself with drama, but simply sits there, year after year, patient and unresolved, waiting for someone dull enough and dutiful enough to fix it. The someone, as is so often the case, turned out to be a committee. There existed, and still exists in a renamed form, an international body known then as the CCITT, the International Telegraph and Telephone Consultative Committee, a standing assembly under the umbrella of the older International Telecommunication Union, whose entire reason for being was to sit in rooms and agree upon the precise manner in which the machines of the world's nations would be permitted to speak to one another. This is not a body that history remembers with parades. It produced recommendations, numbered and lettered, printed in thick volumes, debated line by delegations of engineers and postal officials and telephone administrators from many countries, each protecting its own equipment, its own investments, its own quiet national preferences. And yet it is worth pausing here in the dark to consider that the ordinary miracle by which any fax could reach any other fax was not born of a single inventor's flash of genius, but of years of meetings, of adjournments and reconvenings, of motions carried and tabled, until agreement was slowly, painstakingly ground into being. You may let all of it drift past. It is only soothing to know that somewhere, patiently, it was done. The committee's work arrived in stages, each one a treaty of its own. Around 1968 came the standard the world would later call Group 1, an analog method by which a machine could send a single page in roughly 6 minutes, a pace that seems, from our vantage, almost tender in its slowness. A page unspooling line by line over the better part of a coffee's cooling. It worked, and it was agreed upon, and that agreement was itself the achievement, more than the speed. Then, around 1976, came Group 2, refining the method, tightening the timing, halving the weight, so that a page might cross in something nearer to 3 minutes, still analog, still a matter of tones warbling patiently down a line, but faster and standardized and blessed by the same slow authority. These were real improvements, and they mattered, but they were, in the end, refinements of an older idea, the machine still scanning and singing its page across the wire in the manner its ancestors had. And then, in 1980, the committee delivered the recommendation that changed everything, the one that deserves to be spoken of with the gravity of a founding document, the standard known as Group 3. Where the earlier methods had sent the page as a continuous analog signal, Group 3 was digital. It broke the page into a grid of tiny points, black or white. And then, crucially, it compressed them, recognizing that most of a page is empty, that a sheet of writing is mostly the whiteness between the marks, and that one need not laboriously transmit every scrap of that emptiness, but could instead encode it in shorthand, describing long runs of blankness in a few economical symbols. And so the page that had once taken 6 minutes now crossed an ordinary telephone line in about a minute, over the same copper wires that carried the world's voices, requiring no special circuit, no dedicated link, no prearranged partnership, only a phone number and another Group 3 machine at the far end. This was the quiet hinge of the entire history. From that agreement forward, a fax machine was no longer an island. It could dial any other, anywhere, and be understood. The private dialects fell silent, and a single common tongue spread across the earth, ratified not by conquest, but by consensus, in a numbered recommendation most of the people it served would never read and never need. But a standard, if elegant, is only a set of rules on paper, a possibility waiting for a reason to become a habit, and the reason, the true engine that drove the fax from a specialist's tool into an object as ordinary as a kettle, came from a single nation, and from something as deep and as old as the way that nation had chosen to write. Japanese writing is not built from a small alphabet of a couple of dozen letters. It weaves together syllabaries with thousands of kanji, characters inherited and adapted over centuries, each a small architecture of strokes, and while this is a system of extraordinary richness and beauty, it had always sat awkwardly with the machines the modern office demanded. The typewriter, that clattering triumph of the Western desk, assumed a handful of keys and a handful of letters, and it simply could not be made graceful for a language of thousands of characters. The telex, the teleprinter network that businesses elsewhere leaned upon to send text across distances, labored under the same assumption and served Japan poorly. To type in the Japanese office was to fight the tool. And here the fax machine offered something close to deliverance, because the fax did not care what was on the page. It did not need to know a letter from a character, an alphabet from a syllabary. It did not read at all. It simply photographed the page, whatever the page held, and sent the picture of it down the line. And so a message could be written by hand, in one's own strokes, in the fee richness of the writing system, and dispatched in a minute to the other side of the country, without ever asking a machine to understand a single character. What had been the fax's old weakness elsewhere, its indifference to meaning, its willingness only to copy appearances, became in Japan its supreme and liberating virtue. The handwritten note, the sketched diagram, the seal pressed in red, all of it could travel exactly as it looked. For a culture in which the handwritten hand carried its own weight of courtesy and character, this was not a compromise, but a gift. So Japan embraced the fax more completely, more thoroughly, more affectionately than any nation on earth, folding it into the fabric of ordinary life until it sat in offices and shops and homes as a fixture rather than a novelty. And because the demand was there, deep and genuine and national, the great Japanese electronics firms turned their considerable attention to the machine, and they refined it and they refined it again, making it smaller and cheaper and faster and more reliable, driving the price downward year by year until a device that had once been the preserve of institutions became something an ordinary business and then an ordinary household could simply own. It was Japanese industry, more than any other, that took the committee's clean new standard and built it into millions of affordable machines, and in doing so carried the fax outward from its own shores to the desks of the world, where offices everywhere, almost without noticing the debt, adopted the machines that Japan's writing system had made necessary and Japan's factories had made cheap. And this is the strange twofold rescue at the heart of the story, worth holding gently as the mind drifts. A technology that had wandered the wilderness for the better part of a century, brilliant and orphaned and forever nearly obsolete, was carried at last into universal life by two forces neither glamorous nor obvious, the one a solemn international committee grinding out its numbered recommendations in quiet rooms, the other an ancient and beautiful way of writing that no typewriter could ever tame. Between them, the dry procedure and the deep tradition, they did what 100 years of inventors had not managed. They made the fax machine, of all things, something the whole world could finally, ordinarily, agree upon. And so the machine came home to rest, at last, upon the desk. There had been a time, not so very long before, when the facsimile machine was a rare and specialized instrument, a thing kept in a back room and tended by people who understood it. But somewhere in the warm middle of the 1980s and on through the 1990s, the fax machine completed its long, patient migration into ordinary life, until there was one in nearly every office, and then a smaller one beside it, and then one at the front desk, and one in the back, and one humming faintly in the corner of a room where no one quite remembered putting it. It became furniture. It became infrastructure. It became the sort of object a person walked past 100 times a day without seeing, the way one does not see a door frame or a radiator or the weather. And this, you will understand, is the truest sign of a technology at the very height of its powers. Not that it is admired, but that it is forgotten, that it has sunk so completely into the ordinary that no one thinks to marvel at it at all. For a while, it was even a thing to be proud of. To have a fax machine was to be reachable, to be modern, to be a serious concern with which serious people might do business. The number was printed on the letterhead and on the business card, a second telephone number wearing a slightly more important coat, and to give it out was to say, quietly, that one belonged to the connected world. It sat there on the desk in its beige or its grey, a squat and patient animal, warm to the touch along one flank, smelling faintly of heated paper and machine oil, and it waited, as it had been built to wait, for another of its kind to call. And when the call came, there occurred a small ceremony, and it is this ceremony that I would like, if you will permit me, to describe with the care it deserves. There is nothing here to hold on to. You need only let it happen, the way you would let a distant sound arrive across water in the evening. When one fax machine wishes to speak to another, it does not simply begin, it announces itself. The calling machine, having dialed, sends out into the line a single, plaintive tone, repeated at a slow and even interval, a soft chirp offered again and again into the dark, as if to ask, gently and without expectation whether anyone at all is there. This is the calling tone, and there is something almost devotional in it, this patient repetition, this small voice calling out at measured intervals to a stranger it cannot see. And the answering machine, when it has lifted the line, replies with a tone of its own, a steady, unbroken note held long and level, the answer tone, which says in the only language the two of them share, "I am here. I am a machine like you. Please continue." And then begins the negotiation. And it is a marvelous thing, and it is entirely made of noise. Having greeted one another, the two machines must now agree upon the terms of their conversation, for neither yet knows how fast the other can speak, nor how clear the line between them may be. So they exchange a rapid burst of information, a stuttering rush of tones, each machine describing itself to the other, its speeds, its capabilities, the finest resolution it can manage. They propose, they test. The calling machine sends a long practice signal, a training sequence, so that the receiver may listen to how the line has bruised and bent it, and judge from this what speed the two of them may safely attempt. And if the line is poor, they will patiently agree to slow down and try again, stepping down through the speeds, testing once more, until they find a pace at which they can understand one another without error. To the human ear, this whole exchange is nothing but ugliness, a burst of shrieks and buzzes and grinding static, a harsh mechanical warble that one instinctively wishes to hold away from the ear. And yet consider what is truly happening in that unlovely noise. Two machines, strangers, meeting for the first and perhaps the only time across an unknowable distance of copper wire, are introducing themselves, are inquiring after one another's health, are courteously establishing the fastest speed at which each can be understood by the other, and are settling with great care into a shared understanding so that a single page may pass faithfully between them. It is a courtship. It is a greeting between equals, conducted in a language neither of them chose, and it is, if you listen to it in the right frame of mind, at midnight, with your eyes closed, very nearly a kind of song. And when the two of them had at last agreed, the page began to come. It arrived not all at once, but slowly, line by line, crawling out of the machine at the far end onto a roll of thermal paper. And here we must pause over the paper itself, for it was a peculiar and rather melancholy substance. It was not printed upon in ink, it bore no ribbon and no toner. It was instead a paper coated with chemicals that darkened when heat was pressed against them, so that the image was not laid onto the page, but coaxed out of it, burned gently into being by a warm printhead. The paper came in long rolls, and it emerged shiny and faintly slick to the touch, and it smelled ever so slightly of chemistry, and it curled. It curled with great determination, remembering the roll it had come from, so that a received fax would coil itself up on the desk like a small sleeping thing, and had to be flattened beneath a stapler or a coffee mug or a heavy and reluctant hand. And the paper carried within it a quiet tragedy, which is that the very same sensitivity to heat that allowed it to receive an image also ensured that it could not keep one, for thermal paper fades. Left in a warm drawer, or touched by sunlight, or simply left alone long enough with time and the ambient heat of the ordinary world, the darkened marks slowly grow pale and paler, and the words retreat back toward the blankness they came from. And so there were filing cabinets in those years full of faxes that were quietly, invisibly erasing themselves, whole archives of contracts and confirmations and urgent messages fading gently toward an unmarked white, so that a person opening the folder years later might find only a smooth and innocent sheet, bearing no trace at all of whatever had once been so important that it simply could not wait for the post. Around this humble machine grew a whole liturgy of small human rituals, and these too are worth remembering. There was the cover sheet, that formal first page announcing who the message was from and for whom it was intended, and how many pages were to follow, so that one might know whether the transmission had arrived entire or whether some sheet had gone astray in the copper. There was the phrase, endlessly repeated across the working world, "Please confirm receipt," a small, anxious prayer sent along with the pages, for the sender could never be quite certain the thing had truly arrived, and so asked the human on the far end to telephone back and say, "Yes, it is here, it came through." There was the standing and waiting, the peculiar and now almost vanished act of standing beside the machine while it worked, watching the page inch its way out into the world, listening to the mechanism draw and feed and hum. There was the paper jam and the busy signal, that flat, repeated tone that meant the distant machine was already deep in conversation with someone else. And there was the resending, the patient redialing, the trying once more, and once more again. And then, inevitably, because any pipe into which the world may pour things will eventually have unwelcome things poured into it, there came the junk fax. For the machine, so trusting, would receive whatever was sent to it, and there arose those who discovered they could send unsolicited advertisements to fax numbers by the thousand, cheap holidays and dubious investments and printer supplies, and every such page arrived at its cost not to the sender but to the recipient, consuming the recipient's own paper, and the recipient's own heat of ink, and the recipient's own patience, page after unwanted page, grinding out overnight, so that a person might arrive in the morning to find the roll exhausted and the floor carpeted in curling advertisements for something they had never desired. And this proved so genuinely maddening, so quietly infuriating a theft of another's paper, that in time actual laws were written against it, notably in the United States, laws forbidding the sending of unsolicited advertising by fax. One of the first times, perhaps, that a legislature had been moved to defend the sanctity of a citizen's paper roll. You do not need to remember any of this. It is enough tonight simply to picture it, the warm machine humming in the corner of a quiet office, its number on 1,000 cards, its language a song only another machine could love, patiently pulling pages that were already, even as they arrived, beginning to fade. An ordinary machine, at the exact and unrepeatable height of its long and improbable powers. And so we arrive at the part of the story that the story itself did not anticipate, the part where the machine, having been born too early, having spent a century being overtaken, refuses, quite politely, to end. One might reasonably have assumed that the arrival of electronic mail would settle the matter, that a message which could cross the world in the time it takes to blink would leave no room for a device that whirred and beeped and rendered its documents one slow scanned line at a time. And yet the fax machine did not vanish. It did something stranger. It stayed. It settled into the corners of the most serious institutions we have, the hospitals and the ministries and the courts, and there it remains, humming faintly, waiting, as it has always waited, to receive. Consider the hospital, where the survival is most quietly astonishing. In an age of electronic health records, of vast databases and encrypted portals, a great many hospitals and clinics have gone on sending patient information the way they sent it in the 1980s, which is to say, by fax, one page at a time across a telephone line. The reasons are not glamorous, which is precisely why they are durable. Different hospitals bought different record systems that do not speak to one another, and a fax, indifferent to all of them, speaks to everyone equally. It asks nothing of the machine on the other end except that it be a fax as well. And there is a legal comfort in it, a sense, whether or not it is fully deserved, that a document sent down a dedicated line is somehow more private, more contained, less likely to spill sideways into the wide and leaky world than an email. So the referral goes by fax, the prescription goes by fax, the record follows the patient by fax, page after page, in a hospital filled with computers, and no one finds this remarkable enough to stop. You do not need to hold on to any of this. It is simply true, and it is happening somewhere right now. The pattern repeats itself in government, where inertia is not a flaw, but very nearly a design principle. For decades, the offices of bureaucracies across the world went on requiring forms by fax, long after the citizens filling them out had forgotten they owned a fax machine at all. Japan, a nation the rest of the world tends to imagine as a place of the future, of bullet trains and glowing cities, kept the fax machine close to its administrative heart well into the 21st century, its government offices relying on it deep into the 2020s, so thoroughly that efforts to be rid of it became small news events in themselves, meeting a resistance that was gentle but real. There is a tenderness in that if you look at it a certain way, a whole apparatus of officials who had, over long careers, come to trust the sound of the handshake and the sight of the emerging page, and who saw no urgent reason to surrender either. Germany, too, kept its fax machines running through offices and clinics and legal practices with a thoroughness that became something of a national observation, the fax standing there in the bureaucracy like a piece of the furniture that everyone had simply agreed to keep. The machine had become, in these places, less a technology than a habit, and habits, as anyone drifting toward sleep well knows, are the last things to leave.
And then there is the law, where the fax achieved perhaps its most improbable dignity. For the law decided, in its slow and careful way, that a faxed signature was real. This was no small thing. A signature is the point at which a person and a promise are joined. And for a long stretch of years, the courts and the contracts and the conventions of business held that a signature carried down a telephone line and printed onto a page at the far end was a genuine article, admissible, binding, worthy of trust in a way that an email, that weightless and copyable thing, was for many years not quite granted. There is a logic to it that is almost touching. The fax produced an object. It produced a page you could hold, a mark that had physically traveled and physically arrived. And the law has always had a fondness for objects, for things that exist in the world and can be placed in a folder. And so, in offices where deals were closed and papers were signed, the fax lingered, not out of laziness, but out of a kind of respect, because it was the machine that made a promise into a thing you could touch. You need not remember why. You may simply let it be so.
Beneath all of this, quietly, ran the small businesses that never had a reason to stop. The dental practice, the shipping firm, the little legal office above the shop, the parts supplier at the edge of the industrial estate. For them, the fax was never a statement about the future or the past. It was a machine that worked, that had always worked, that sat in the corner and did its one job without complaint or subscription or update. And to replace a thing that works, for no reason other than that it is old, is an argument that has never much persuaded anyone with a business to run and a day to get through. So they kept it, and in keeping it, without ever intending to, they helped a 19th century idea survive into a century its inventor could not possibly have imagined.
There is an irony here, and the gentle thing to do is to let it lie exactly where it falls, without pointing at it, without turning it into a joke. The fax machine, in the person of Alexander Bain and his swinging pendulums, arrived in 1843, a full generation, perhaps several, before the world had any use for it. It spent its youth as a curiosity, its middle age as an also-ran, forever the technology that was almost useful, forever being passed by. And then, having been early for so long, it did the one thing no one expected of the perpetual latecomers opposite. It outlasted them. It outlasted the telegram that overshadowed it. It outlasted the systems that were built to replace it, and the systems built to replace those. In an age that prized speed above nearly everything, the slow machine simply endured, because it turned out that speed was not the only thing the world valued. It also valued the page you could hold, the line that felt private, the habit no one wished to break, the object that made a promise real. And so we come to rest where the whole long story was always going to end, not with a triumph and not with a funeral, but a beige box on a shelf in the back of an office somewhere, its little light glowing, its paper loaded, its line connected. No one is looking at it. No one has looked at it in some time. It is not important, and it does not need to be. It has stopped being a piece of the future and stopped being a piece of the past, and become instead something rarer and more restful, a thing that is simply still here, faithful and unhurried, asking nothing, needing nothing, waiting only, as it has waited since the days of the pendulum, to receive. You can let the whole arc of it go now, the pendulums and the patents and the standards and the handshake tone, all of it drifting off softly into the dark, because none of it was ever yours to carry. It was only ever a machine, humming quietly in a room you will never visit, on a night that asks nothing of you at all. Sleep well, and when you next find yourself wanting to forget for just an hour everything that actually matters, the useless hour will be waiting. Good night.